Events are unfolding at such a speed. It's hard to stay on top of everything. It really is. I mean, 1 week of events feels like months. Look, what do I think about the Oval Office? It was embarrassing, I think, for Trump, for Vance, and probably for Zelensky, who I believe was ambushed, but equally, I think probably was ill-advised to respond in the way that he did to the provocation that he was subjected to. So it was unprecedented and very uncomfortable to watch. But I think in a very weird way, it has catalyzed in just the space of a week or so some dramatic responses from Europe and indeed from Zelensky as well in a weird sort of way. And I don't think this is necessarily a grand plan that's sort of unfolding, if you like. I don't think this is premeditated. I just think it's happening as a sort of direct product of the very, very disruptive Trump style, the very disruptive interventions on trade, on the war, on domestic US issues as well. It's quite bewildering what's happening. I think it'd be wrong to assume that in some way, shape or form, Donald Trump is like some master puppeteer. I don't think that at all. But a product of his totally disruptive interventions on major issues then has catalyzed a remarkable activity on all of the issues that have unfolded this week. It's really hard to be definitive because there are so many different announcements from day to day. On one day, the 25% tariffs are being imposed on Canadian and Mexican exports. And the next day, there's some sort of new announcement about how some sectors are going to be exempt from those tariffs. There was an announcement that the 25% tariffs would be imposed and would come into effect on the 4th of March. Then there was an announcement that there would be some relief for automotive exports from Mexico and Canada. And then the following day, the exemptions were expanded. I think also there were measures to delay the imposition of the tariffs by a month. And this, I think, speaks to what I have been saying about the tariff policy for some time. In a way, I think the threat of tariffs is a negotiating tactic. Trump is trying to engage with all of the US's major trading partners to extract better trading terms. I think his ambition is clearly to encourage companies who are currently exporting to the US, from whether it's from China or Canada or in Mexico. What he's keen to do is to encourage or force those companies to locate their manufacturing in the US. It's all part of the MAGA policy. So I think markets have begun to worry more about tariffs and the potential economic and inflationary implications, or growth and inflationary implications of tariffs. It's not yet at all clear where we will end up in next week or even in 3 or 6 months' time. It's just not clear. So it's too early to make any definitive conclusions about what tariffs are going to be imposed, when they're going to be imposed, how punitive they're going to be, and how businesses and economies are going to react to them. It's just too early because this picture changes every single day. What we can conclude and what is clear is that Trump is using tariffs as a weapon in a negotiation to extract better trading terms with those exporters. And indeed, ultimately, his aim is to extract or to force businesses, as I've said, to relocate manufacturing in the US economy and to revitalize the US manufacturing base. I think people who are surprised by how he is behaving were not paying attention during the campaign or in the lead up to the inauguration. I think it was pretty clear that he would be disruptive on a whole load of different fronts. Well, I've been surprised about what he said about Ukraine and indeed Russia. I think some of those comments, I think he'll come to regret. But has he become more of a threat to markets than a consensus may have expected? I think probably the answer to that is yes. And I think you see that reflected in the weakness that you've seen in the S&P and in NASDAQ. I think there is clearly a growing concern in the US about what the implications of that policy approach will be. Some are concluding that it won't be good for the US economy. But I think it's important to keep balanced perspective, which is probably slightly uncomfortable because what markets hate is uncertainty. And I think that in a way, as much as they're concerned about what he's saying, the fact that it changes almost by the day is creating a level of uncertainty that markets feel uncomfortable with. But by the same token, I think we shouldn't lose sight of some of the more benign things that have followed Trump's policies. The not least, of course, is that the oil price has weakened significantly, as I thought it would do. His cheap energy policy is very, very important for his broader economic strategy for the US economy. And to some extent, he's getting his way. OPEC is growing production. The oil price is already weak. I think Saudi has already agreed to increase production. And I think that's important for the world economy. Lower oil prices, lower energy prices are going to be stimulative for the global economy. So I don't want to get too concerned at the moment about the uncertainty that's being generated by Trump's unpredictability, because there are mitigations. I suppose there's a political dimension, an important political dimension. Trump's presidency is not just about tariffs, tax cuts, and a war on waste, if you like, or a war on the blob. There's been a massive political shift in the US away from the woke agenda, DEI, ESG. The championing, for example, cheap energy has had all sorts of implications, which I think are beginning to be reflected in the equity market, for example, with respect to renewable energy and the growth that everybody was very confident of under Biden. That's now being revisited. The huge fiscal incentives for renewable investment and indeed for semiconductor investment in the US, it would appear, have gone. That part of the political agenda, I think, shouldn't be underestimated, and I think will ripple across the world and certainly across Europe. Now, I think there is a lot of resistance to that sort of political approach across Europe and in the UK. You can already start to see the impact of Trump's agenda, his broader political, philosophical agenda, if you want to call it that. You can already start to see that. For example, I think this is very important for the UK economy. I've written about Britain's energy policy and its unilateral pursuit of carbon neutrality has had a very damaging impact on industry in the UK economy. And I think it's definitely had an impact on the economy's ability to grow and on living standards, because the pursuit of carbon neutrality, certainly in the energy system, has created incredibly high electricity prices, energy prices more generally across the UK. They are the highest in the world by some margin for companies. I think Rachel Reeves is beginning to recognise that this energy policy is not compatible with the growth agenda that she keeps talking about. Now, I'm absolutely confident that we would not be hearing that were it not for Trump's presidency. It may eventually have happened, but it's come a lot quicker as a result of Trump, what Trump is doing in the US and Trump's low-cost energy strategy. And I think it's going to ripple across Europe as well. So that's another very important implication, I think, that we haven't touched on so far in this discussion. But I think remarkably, in the space of 6 weeks, I think the UK government is beginning to start to rethink its energy policy fundamentally. Watch this space. Probably the most remarkable reaction is what's happened in Europe, and in particular probably what's happened in Germany. In a way, Keir Starmer sort of led the way by announcing that the UK would significantly step up its defence spending in response to that Oval Office disaster. And I think that then threw the gauntlet down for Europe more generally. The EU itself has put in place rather arcane mechanisms to allow countries to borrow more money to fund additional defence spending on a very significant scale. But that's dwarfed by what's happened in Germany. Ahead of the new government taking office, the Chancellor-in-Waiting has basically struck a deal with the SPD, another political party in Germany, and they have together agreed a plan which will be subject to a 2/3 majority vote very shortly. But that plan is a dramatic fiscal incentive plan designed to do a couple of things. First of all, to significantly expand Germany's defence spending from where it is currently, which is about 2% to 3.5% of GDP. And in addition to that, significantly increase fiscal spending on the domestic economy, on infrastructure. although the numbers are hard to pin down at the moment, and it's a bit early to be too sort of definitive about what the numbers actually are, but I've read today, for example, that the measures together will liberate €1 trillion of additional fiscal spending in Germany over the next few years, which is a huge about turn from the fiscal austerity that Germany's been subjected to since the financial crisis. And will take debt to GDP from its current level of about 63% of GDP to about apparently 84% of GDP, which is, a very, very dramatic change in German policy and was not anticipated at all. Now, this, I think people will now, in the wake of this, have to revise their views. I will certainly have to rethink my views on the outlook for the German economy. This is a massive fiscal injection, a massive fiscal stimulus, which will change the growth dynamic in Germany. It's already had an impact on German 10-year yields, which have gone up significantly. And it's generally seen as a sort of a significant sort of divergence from policy, which has largely been in place since German reunification in the early 90s. So it's very, very significant for Germany. It's very significant for Europe. And I think it is directly catalyzed by those events in the Oval Office, in a way, and Trump's disruptive approach to the war in Ukraine. Well, to some extent, European equity markets have really welcomed what's happened. European equities, and particularly the DAX, has performed very well year to date. And indeed, this week, the DAX, I think on one day was up 3.5%. So German infrastructure stocks, German defense stocks were very strong on the back of what was announced. So analysts will have to revisit their Germany growth forecast. Analysts will have to, I think, also revisit their EU growth forecast. I mean, Germany is the most dominant economy in the EU, and of course it will ripple across the rest of Europe. But one thing that I should say, though, here now, is that Germany had the fiscal headroom to do this because its debt to GDP level is significantly lower than the rest of Europe. Of course, other big economies in the EU, like the Italian or the French economy, just don't have this level of fiscal headroom. And that's why the EU package, which was announced, I think, on the same day, was significant because it will enable other European countries to up their defence spending without stressing their debt to GDP ratios. Markets have been very efficient, and so they've, to some extent, already discounted some of the benefit that will accrue from this additional spending. This week, German equities were very strong, and particularly stocks that are exposed to German infrastructure spending and defence spending are up significantly. I need to do a bit more work on what's in the price and what isn't, but it demands another look, that's for sure. Well, in many ways, it's similar to the impact on Europe. Suddenly, the UK has been shocked by Trump's announcements into clearly having to accept that it's going to have to spend more on defence, and I believe substantially more than the relatively small increase to 2.5% of GDP. By the way, Germany looks like it's going to 3.5% of GDP. So in a way, Germany's picked up the gauntlet that Keir Starmer threw down a week or so ago and picked it up and slapped the UK around the face with it because they've gone to 3.5% of GDP. So look, there is much less fiscal headroom in the UK. Taking defence spending to 2.5%, even to 3% of GDP is going to stress public finances. The UK government has said repeatedly that it cannot borrow more money. So if it's going to stick to that, then it has a limited set of options, really. It can tax more or it can cut spending. And having already increased taxes significantly in the October budget, which I think now probably this government is regretting because it's had a very negative impact on the economy and on the inflation, short-term inflation data. My guess was that the government would have to start talking about spending cuts in this March statement. But I think Rachel Reeves is going to have to announce significant spending cuts to give her the headroom to spend more on defence and probably spend more on some of the other things that are increasingly becoming important. So my guess is that she will look to welfare. It is the biggest single item of government expenditure. And in particular, I think they'll look at incapacity benefit, which has exploded since COVID and is forecast in recent data to increase very significantly, I think from £65 billion a year to £100 billion a year in a matter of a few years. So that is unaffordable. And I think this government has got to take a close look at incapacity benefit. So I think she will pay quite a lot of attention to that. So my expectation is that at the end of this month, we'll hear about restricting spending in that particular benefit. She'll have to announce something meaningful because that will give her the headroom, and it will certainly mean that the OBR, who will be negative, they'll downgrade their growth forecast for the UK economy. So that will create a bit more stress in the fiscal arithmetic. So the spending cuts could be quite meaningful. China has announced further measures to support the economy, further fiscal measures, further targeted measures at promoting consumption growth. I've seen all sorts of different views on this. Some analysts have said the quantum of the measures was disappointing. Others have said these are very welcome and that we should expect further announcements to come from the Chinese government that will add to the already announced measures. I've been saying since last September that we should expect that there will be incremental measures announced and that the Chinese government is determined to address the fundamental economic challenges that are affecting the domestic economy in China. It would be wrong to underestimate their commitment to delivering the outcome that they want to see. And I think this week we've seen important measures announced, which I think are part and parcel of that journey for policymakers to genuinely address the major structural problems that the Chinese economy is grappling with. So I think in general, the Chinese equity market has welcomed these measures. There is a growing level of confidence, I think, in Chinese equity markets. And the performance of some of the leading technology stocks, I think, reflects that.